get the show on the road. 2021, Sergei Nov. Okay, so let's actually go e5 this time. We haven't actually played e5 that often, funnily enough, even though it's probably the move that most people in the chat play. And we're facing a right Lopez. And I'm thinking we'll go for the main line. I'm thinking we'll go for the main line, which is, of course, a6, bishop a4, and knight f6. Yeah, this was first played by Paul Morphy, and since then it's become the main line. Thank you, Alice. CPU. All right, so what is the main move here? So there's an interesting distinction to be made. So it's not bishop c5. Bishop c5 is called the archangel, b5 and bishop c5. The main move is bishop to e7, just modestly developing the bishop to e7. And I'll talk a little bit after the game about some of the possible lines here. Now, when I say main line, I don't necessarily mean it's the best line. It's just the most popular variation. And at this point, the move rook e1 actually poses a threat. Now, you'll notice that at various points in the right Lopez, white can take the knight and take the pawn. Here, it doesn't make much sense because the pawn on e4 is hanging. But once he plays rook e1, bishop takes c6 and knight takes c5 actually becomes a threat. So you might think, well, then it's time to play d6. But before d6, we throw in a move which is very, very helpful. We start by playing b5, grabbing space on the queen side, forcing the bishop back. And now, generally speaking, we play d6. But we don't have to play d6 anymore because the pawn on e5 is no longer hanging. The main move is still d6, not in order to defend the pawn, but in order to open up the bishop. But we can also play the Marshall gambit, which is castles, not moving the d-pawn, and hoping to play d5 in one fell swoop. So let's try. I want to play the Marshall. Let's castle. And if white plays c3 here, then we have a choice of playing the Marshall with d5 or transposing back into the main line with d6. And he plays c3. Let's go with the Marshall gambit, d5. Now, I'm sure most people in the chat have probably seen this before. It's a very common guess at the highest level. And of course, the gambit is because we sacrifice the pawn on e5. Knight takes e5, rook takes e5. All right, so our knight is hanging. Who knows what the main move for black is here? We need to do something about the threat of capturing the knight. Now, if you don't know this, it's a little bit hard to figure out why the best move is what it is, and I can talk a little bit about that after the game. The best move here is to defend the knight with a pawn, c6. Defending the knight with a pawn, generally defending a piece with a pawn, is going to be the best way forward. Now, we need to get this rook off of e5. It's really in our way. We need to create chances against white's king. And in order to do that, we need to... How do we chase the rook away? Well, we need to do it knowing that once the rook moves, our pieces need to be aimed at the white king. So, moves bishop d6. And we go queen h4, bringing the queen into the attack, sinking it into h3. This is all theory. And at this point, I myself am not a huge Marshall specialist. I'm rusty on the theory, but we'll figure it out. And it looks like white might be out of book as well, given that he's taking a good chunk of time here. Now, it's very clear where our compensation derives from. We've got, I would say, an advantage in development. And white's got Swiss cheese light squares on the king side, particularly given that this bishop would love to be on g2 here. If this bishop were on g2, black would have no compensation. But given that the bishop is not on g2 and has no way of getting there, white is going to have to deal with the long-term weakness of his weak light squares. And so the immediate threat is bishop to g4, attacking the queen and trying to sink it into f3 for a lobster pincer mate eventually. Yeah, Marshall lost to Capablanca, so Frank James Marshall, who was the first to play the Marshall, the game where he played it for the first time, he did, I believe, lose to Capablanca, but, you know, that doesn't mean the line is bad, and that doesn't mean it shouldn't bear his name. Knight d2 is not, to my knowledge, one of the main lines. It's a sensible move. I mean, he develops the knight, but it's a bit awkward. I mean, now the bishop can't move. And he doesn't do anything against the possibility of developing the bishop to g4. So my question, why not? Let's play bishop g4, see where his queen... Okay, after... Whoa. f3 in such positions is tremendously weakening. And there's a super typical tactic that oftentimes stems from this weakness. And I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. What am I talking about? And the moment f3 is played, you should start thinking about this. This is a pattern that you should, you know, hammer into your head. Well, it's not knight e3, folks, because that blunders the knight. It's bishop takes g3. So the move f3, it weakens the pawn on g3. That's a weak link in white's position. And sacking the bishop on g3 is often a very low-risk venture. Why is it low risk? Aren't we sacking the bishop? Well, because we have perpetual check in our pocket. Once he takes the bishop, at the very least, we have perpetual check in our pocket. And remember that if you're evaluating a sacrifice and you're trying to win the game, but you spot a perpetual, that's still very valuable. Because if you've spotted at least a draw, then, you know, the sacrifice becomes very low risk. And you can spend essentially the rest of your time trying to find a win. If you don't find it, okay, of course you want it to win, but still a draw is better than a loss. So don't discount ideas like that where you have a guaranteed draw, because I can really lower the risk of going for something that otherwise would be super, super risky. So what happens here? Well, if he takes the light squared bishop, then he gets checkmated. Queen h2, king f1, queen f2. So essentially, kind of has to take this bishop. I guess technically rook e2 should be considered by white. Maybe rook e2 is, in fact, the best move. I don't know. But we'll cross that bridge if he plays it. And if he takes this bishop, then we play queen takes g3. Everybody can see the perpetual we have. But I believe that we have more than just a perpetual. If he goes for this, and I think it's actually quite straightforward. The attacking method is quite straightforward. So start thinking about what we're going to do in the event of takes and king h1. How are we going to create threats that are better than just a perpetual? Okay, he keeps disconnecting. Knight f1 is played. All right, that's not a very testing move. And one of the big mistakes people make when they're sacrificing and attacking is forgetting that we can just win material in certain cases. So here you might be thinking about bishop takes f3. Well, then queen takes f3 and we have nothing. Bishop takes h2, knight takes h2, nothing there. But wait a minute, the rook is just hanging. So we just take the rook and we're up in exchange. And the attack continues, so black is winning here. Relatively straightforward attack. After f takes g4, some work is still required, though. It's not entirely over. And if he takes this bishop, then we can play bishop takes f3. Yeah, the marshal's very dangerous if white doesn't know the theory. The move was knight f4 in the other line, yes. Knight f4 in the other line was winning. One interesting thing about the marshal is that at the highest level, it often leads to a draw. Because if white knows the theory, then in most lines, the majority of lines actually go into an endgame, where black needs to be a little bit careful to make a draw. But at lower levels, the marshal is often played as a winning line in order to play for a win, because if you don't know the theory, then, as I said, you're liable to get attacked. All right, so what should we do here? Well, we can move our bishop back to h4, but that's a little bit too plain vanilla. Can we squeeze more out of the situation? Yes, we can. We can play rook a to e8, defend the bishop, and simultaneously bring the rook into the game. All right. And where can this rook go? Well, it can go up to e4 in order to attack g4. That could be simply a crushing idea. It doesn't matter. Rook a8, rook fe8. The only reason I put the a rook on e8 is because I thought potentially I could play f5 and try to open up the f file. That's literally the only thing that entered my mind. Otherwise, I don't think it really matters. I thought that I might push this f pawn out, and if he trades, then this other rook might get into the game. Bishop f4. Well, the move f5 I mentioned is quite a good idea here, but I don't see a reason not to stick with our original plan and play what move? I mean, f5 actually does look really, really nice here. Yeah. Rook e4 is great. Actually, you know what? Let's play f5, because if we can open up the F file, the win is going to come a lot faster. If we play rook e4, our opponent plays bishop back to g3. We trade the bishops. Then we take the pawn on g4, and we're up another pawn. But it's going to take a while for us to translate that into mate. Let's play f5. Let's at least try to get the f file open. He's probably going to go g5, which would be correct. But then we have a passed pawn on f5, which could later push out to f4 and accelerate the pace of the attack. As I often say, in such positions, it's less about the specific moves that you play, because there's going to be a lot of stuff that wins the game. As long as you're following a pretty consistent strategy and you're making healthy, straightforward attacking moves, you'll be fine. Bishop e5 is a good move. Intercepting the rook. So now our bishop hangs, just visiting family. And we need to move the bishop at this point. So now it's time for bishop h4. This bishop is not an issue, though. If we can open up the f file, the game ends quickly. Thank you, Hashmi, with the 16 months. And let's take with the rook. Now the f file is ours. Yeah, there's a million threats. Rook f2, rook f8, g5. Queen e2. What do we do? Well, rook g5, knight g3. Or rook g5, king h1. So I would either double up the rooks, go rook f8, or I would go with the immediate rook f2, attacking the queen and threatening checkmate on g2. The only issue with rook f2 is that he can take that rook, and at the end of the day, he's going to have 2 pieces for the queen. That might last a little bit longer. So if we want to play for a maximum, if we really want to finish the game as quickly as possible, rook e to f8 might be more sensible. But then he might play bishop drops back to g3. So I don't particularly like this approach of trying to find the way to win fastest. If you see a move that wins the queen, and you know for a fact that you know how to win the resulting position, just do it. Don't be lazy and try to find, It's good to try to find the fastest win, but there is also a limit to that. And I think you can get in trouble when you rule out options just because you feel like they'll take a long time to win. All right. Okay, so let's throw in another rook check just to reposition the rook onto an open file. And now here's the best approach. How is white going to defend against a potential rook lift to g5? What move do we want to eliminate? What defensive resource do we want to somehow eliminate? We want to eliminate the possibility of white blocking a potential check with the knight or the bishop. How can we do that? Can we take that square under control? We absolutely can. We can push the h-pawn out first to h4. White is totally paralyzed. It's not like he can do anything. And then we follow up with a rook lift to g5 and force the king out into the open. Typical idea. Taking a square under... Okay, well, rook d1. Classic mistake here would be to just automatically go h4, but you have to keep your eyes peeled for faster alternatives like queen g4 that would win the rook. Pretty simple game. And at this level, the marshal is a very good weapon against the main line, Lopez. So, just really quickly, rook e1, b5. So we're not going to talk at length about the first part of the game just because, I could talk about the Lopez for ages. But this is not really an opening course. Now, the thing is, at the highest level, people don't really go into the marshal all that much anymore. If you watch people like Wesley and Duda and Geary, they play what's called the anti-marshal. So at the highest level, the marshal is considered to essentially equalize for black. Nobody's found anything serious for white in the marshal. So what you'll often see is people playing a4 in this position, which gets sort of a different kind of position than... You can't play d5 here. I mean, you just blunder b5. And after b4, oftentimes white goes, for example, d4. And this gets its own type of position. Again, you're not permitting black to play d5 and enter the marshal. Thank you, Cyprian Laywood, and he's Madeira. If that makes sense. But even 10 years ago, almost everybody went into the marshal. So, and people still do. It's not like... it's not like people don't go into it. Marshall was actually the second guy to play it. And originally, Marshall's idea was not to take on d5 with the knight. Against a guy named Freer in 1917, and then against Capablanca. No, against Capablanca, he played differently. In his very first game in the Marshall, in a simul, he played e4 here, which still remains the second most popular move. But according to modern day theory, this is not, just not good for black. D c6, ef3, and white could even grab this other pawn. And it turns out that despite black's initiative, if I remember correctly, there is just not enough compensation for the two pawns in a position like this. So in 1918, 1 year later, Marshall kind of realized that, and he went for knight takes d5. But back then, the theory of the Marshall was not very well developed. So after 95 rook e5, Marshall originally, as well as everybody else up until the 1940s, played knight f6. Originally, everybody played knight f6. Nowadays, this is not considered a very good move. And the idea is to re-involve the knight via g4. And the move c6 was only played for the first time in 1939 by C.H.O.D. Alexander, who also worked on, I think, decrypting German communications during World War II. Interestingly, he was also the first person to play c6 in the Marshall. Thank you, love that guy, for the 5. Damn, girl. Damn, girl. Okay, you should watch, what's that movie with Turing? What's that movie with Turing? That has C.H.O.D. Alexander in it. All right, so c6, imitation game. d4, bishop d6, rook e1, queen h4, g3, queen h3. And here there are two main moves. One of them is bishop e3, and the other one is rook e4. Knight d2 is just bad. This move is one line, trying to get to h4 and get rid of the queen. The other line is to get the bishop out first to e3. And if black plays bishop g4 here, then white's queen can swing up to d3 with the idea of bishop f3, queen f1, and white is safe. So there's a tremendous amount of theory here, but nobody has really proven an advantage for white. And currently, black is doing great in the Marshall. Capablanca absolutely did not refute it. It's just that Marshall didn't play accurately because the theory was not well developed. So knight d2 is a essentially fatal mistake because of bishop g4. Perhaps white should have moved the queen to c2, but now rook a8 just wins. And look at this position. Black simply overwhelms white in the center and on the king side. And if white plays knight f3, then this is a very, very nasty pin that we can follow up on with queen h5. King g2, rook e8, white's position is in ruins. So this move knight d2 is a huge mistake. f3, bishop g3. And had white taken on g3, after queen g3, king h1, I do believe that the winning move is knight f4. Bringing the knight into the attack, threatening checkmate on g2. If he defends this way, then we have mate. If he tries to give up the rook to get rid of the knight, then we play bishop takes f3. I think that's the simplest. Takes, then we take the rook, and we have a massive attack on top of the material advantage. So the engine is indicating that the only defensive option here really is to play rook e2 and try to give up the exchange, but avoid the immediate consequences of the attack. Bishop takes e2, queen e2. And of course, black is much, much better. White doesn't have enough for the piece, but rook e8, queen f1, and white can try to survive this. All right, so bishop g4, f3, bishop g3, knight f1, takes, rook e8, and the game is over. Yeah, takes, bishop f4 and f5, trying to open the f file. If white had gone g5, I was thinking now we could go rook e4, and then push the f pawn once the bishop moves. Thank you, Itchy Badger, for the 3 months. I appreciate it. All right. Yeah. So that's that. That was a pretty uneventful game. Any questions about it? Any questions about this game or the Marshall? I've only had a couple of games. I played the Marshall in one classical game with black and drew. I drew Ding Liren on the white side of the Marshall, but I kind of played. I didn't even really test him. It was in a pro chess league. How is h3 instead of c3 to counter the marshal? Yeah, white has several ways to play the anti-marshal. The anti-marshal is not just one thing. It's several moves that discourage black from playing d5. One of them is h3. And I believe d5 here is not accurate because after e d5, knight d5, white does not have to take e5. I think after a4, white is supposed to be better here. Because the c3 square is left open for the knight. That's the key idea. That's the key difference. Yeah, so after h3, black kind of, I think, has to revert to one of the main lines, either d6 or bishop e7. But I don't know. You'll have to check that on your own. I'm not too much of a specialist.